Some children slip through the cracks. Others, like Lynn Sells, fall into glacial crevasses so deep and so cold that neither light nor warmth can penetrate. In the words of Lieutenant Larry Pope, Tommy always drew the short straw. He was born on June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California, as a twin to Nina Sells, also known as Nina Lovins. His twin sister was Tammy Jean. In public, his father was William Sells. When the twins were born, they joined two other siblings, Terry Jo and Timothy Lee. Soon the family was enriched by three more boys, the twins Jerry Kevin and Jimmy Keith, and then Randy Jean. Lynn Sells swore that the biological father of all these children was a man named Joe Lovins, but legally, William Sells held the title of father. He had a regular job with social benefits, most importantly, health insurance for the family. When William Sells got into serious financial trouble, he turned to Lovins, who helped him out of the jam. Tommy Sells claimed, and his mother did not deny this, that Lovins, a car salesman and gambler, used William Sells' debts to force him to adopt the children as his own. Joe Lovins is also the man who gave Sells the words that would become his motto for 2 decades of chaos. Dead men tell no tales. Soon after the family moved back from Oakland, California to Missouri, a crisis occurred. The twins were 18 months old when Tammy Jean developed an extremely high fever. Nina took her to the hospital, arriving around 6 in the morning. The doctor said the baby had pneumonia and placed her in a plastic sheet. Nina sat by her bed and watched as beads of sweat formed, rolled down her little daughter's face, and matted her hair to her head. At 6:30 in the evening, Tammy Jean died. Nina didn't believe the pneumonia diagnosis and insisted on an autopsy. The cause of death was meningitis. As an adult, Tommy commemorated his lost twin sister with a tattoo on his left upper arm, a gravestone with her name. While Nina and the family attended the funeral, Nina's aunt Bonnie Walpole took care of little Tommy. She called urgently, "Nina, Tommy has a terribly high fever. I'm leaving right now. We'll meet at the hospital." Again, the same doctor made the same diagnosis: pneumonia. Nina grabbed Tommy Lynn and said, "You're not going to kill another one of my babies." She ran out of the hospital into a cold, stormy wind. It tugged at the blankets wrapped around her son and exposed his body to the elements. The desperate mother could barely hold on to the blankets, but try as she might, she couldn't wrap her child in them. She left the hospital and drove 90 miles to the next one. Halfway there, the feverish child suddenly sat up. Soon he was chattering and rolling around on the seat as if nothing had happened. When they reached the hospital, a nurse confirmed that Tommy's fever had dropped. He stayed in the facility for 5 days and romped around in his bed. His fever did not return. Soon after his recovery, Nina decided to rent a house from her Aunt Bonnie. When she viewed the house with a sniffling Tommy Lynn in tow, Bonnie offered to watch the toddler until the Sells family had settled into their new home. For 2.5 years, the boy lived with Aunt Bonnie. He claimed it was the only bright spot of his childhood. According to his aunt, his favorite pastime was riding up and down the sidewalk on a tricycle over and over again. When he grew up, he wanted to be a firefighter. He received all the attention a toddler could wish for. Bonnie's 2 daughters, 12-year-old Sandy and 8-year-old Kathy. Every school day, he would go to school to meet the girls when they came home. The trio romped and giggled during dinner and until bedtime. Bonnie and the girls loved the precious boy as if he were their own. So much so that Bonnie wanted to make the relationship permanent and legally binding. After all, she said, Nina didn't visit her son. She didn't inquire about him. In truth, She acted as if she knew nothing of his existence. But the moment Bonnie wanted to adopt him, everything changed. Nina was furious. She yanked Tommy Lynn out of the only home he could remember and brought him back to hers. Bonnie repeatedly tried to visit her former charge, but Nina rejected her attempts and denied her even a brief hug. In hindsight, Bonnie Walpole was burdened with guilt and regret that she hadn't hired a lawyer and fought to keep the little boy. At the age of 7, Tommy began abusing alcohol. His maternal grandfather, Pa Brown, had hidden liquor under the seat of his truck. Around this time, Tommy's school attendance became sporadic. Truancy began as a challenge and soon became a way of life. He was the type of kid who neglected everything you wanted him to do. Going to school was one of those things, his mother Nina recalls. When he was 8 years old, Tommy met a man from the nearby town of Frisbee in Missouri. Frisbee was a small place. They said the population was 97, but I think they counted some people twice, Sells remembered. The man began systematically seducing the boy. He took him on trips to Kennett, taught him billiards, and spent money on him generously. At first, Tommy's visits to the man's house lasted only a few days. Then they became longer. Every time Nina insisted that Tommy come home, he would throw a fit and wouldn't stop begging until she allowed him to return. She let his visits grow longer and longer, and eventually he lived with the man permanently. Tommy enjoyed always having a pocket full of spending money that the man provided, but this newly gained wealth came at a price. According to Tommy, his mother, his Aunt Bonnie, and a psychiatrist who later worked with Sells, the man was a pedophile who sexually abused Tommy and others for years. He was never married, but his house was always teeming with boys. After the man had forced Tommy into sex for the first time, the boy curled up, alone and lonely. He just wanted to talk to someone, but no one was there. When questioned by a Missouri Highway Patrol officer in 2000, the man denied these allegations. Tommy began experimenting with marijuana at the age of 10. Joe Lovins, his alleged biological father, died when Tommy was 11. The last opportunity to speak with his deceased father triggered a flood of emotions. With tears in his eyes, he stood beside the casket. He spoke from the depths of his heart. "A lot of things in my life are really messed up, Dad. I'm ready to talk to you now. I wish you didn't have to leave me so early. I'm really going to miss you." At the age of 13, Tommy left the pedophile's house for good and began his life on the road. He would later say that these were the happiest times of his life, riding freight trains, smoking pot, and drinking alcohol. He had no ties, no obligations, and no expectations. He was his own master. He could set his own path, alone, unbound by any rules except those he chose for himself. His mother never reported him as missing to the police. When he was 14, he hitchhiked to California. A driver dropped him off in front of a church near Sacramento. A man came out of the building and asked if Tommy was hungry. Inside, Tommy sat down to a plate of food. Over the meal, the man asked about Tommy's situation. Tommy told him that he lived with his mother and stepfather, that they had moved to California from Missouri, but he had gotten lost on his way to school that morning. The man offered to help him find his way home. When Tommy refused, saying he was fine on his own, the man insisted. Tommy got into his car. The man drove him to his house, where Tommy would stay for about 6 months. At first, Tommy was happy about the arrangement. He was allowed to smoke cigarettes, and more importantly, the man had a teenage son with whom he could hang out. After a few days, however, Tommy's new guardian began to set rules. Many rules. Rules about when to eat, what to watch on TV, what time to go to bed. Above all, There was one unbreakable rule. Tommy wasn't allowed to leave the property. The son was also trapped. The father kept both boys under constant surveillance. He homeschooled them to prevent them from having contact with the outside world. Tommy suspected that the man had also sexually abused his own son. The stress of captivity began to affect Tommy's health. He developed severe headaches that wouldn't go away. One day, when his guardian was out shopping, Tommy escaped. He walked into town and went to a medical clinic. The doctor prescribed medication for migraine headaches. Tommy never returned to the house of his captor. He resumed his life as a drifter, riding freight trains, hitchhiking, and doing occasional odd jobs. He also began breaking into houses. At first, he only stole food, but soon he was taking anything of value he could carry. He met other teenage runaways and joined their group. Together, they traveled across the country, supporting themselves through petty theft. Around this time, Tommy started using harder drugs. He claimed that between the ages of 14 and 15, he tried everything except heroin. His drug use escalated quickly. By 16, he was heavily addicted to various substances. In 1981, at the age of 17, Tommy stole a car in Missouri. The police caught him, and he was sentenced to 2 years in a juvenile detention facility. He served 18 months before being released for good behavior. While incarcerated, he completed his GED, high school equivalency diploma. After his release, Tommy drifted between Missouri and California. He worked various jobs as a carnival worker, a farmhand, a mechanic, but never stayed in one place for long. His drug use continued, and his behavior became increasingly erratic and violent. By the mid-1980s, Tommy had developed a pattern that would define much of his adult life: periods of relative stability followed by explosive violence and flight. In 1985, when Tommy was 21, he met Daniela, a 19-year-old woman from Nevada. She was working at a truck stop in Reno. Tommy had taken a job there as a mechanic. They began dating, and within a few months, they were living together. For a while, it seemed Tommy might settle down. He stayed clean, worked steadily, and appeared to be building a normal life. Daniela became pregnant, and in 1986, she gave birth to their daughter, Melissa. Tommy was present for the birth and, according to Daniela, seemed genuinely happy about becoming a father. He doted on his daughter and worked extra hours to provide for his new family. However, the stability didn't last. Tommy started using drugs again, primarily methamphetamine. His behavior became increasingly paranoid and aggressive. He accused Daniela of infidelity and began having violent outbursts. When Melissa was 8 months old, Tommy disappeared. He left no note, took nothing with him, and made no attempt to contact Daniela or his daughter. He later told investigators that he had freaked out about the responsibilities of fatherhood and family life. He said he felt trapped and had to escape. This pattern of forming relationships and then suddenly abandoning them would repeat throughout his life. After leaving Reno, Tommy traveled to Missouri, where he stayed briefly with his mother. Nina later recalled that he seemed different, more agitated and unstable than before. He stayed only a few weeks before disappearing again. For the next few years, Tommy moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few months. He worked various jobs under different names, usually quitting or disappearing when employers started asking too many questions about his background. He continued using drugs heavily and supporting himself through a combination of legitimate work and theft. In 1990, he met Jessica, a 23-year-old woman in St. Louis. She was a single mother with 2 young children. Tommy moved in with her and, for a time, played the role of stepfather to her children. He found work as a car mechanic and seemed to be trying to build another stable life. Jessica later told investigators that Tommy could be incredibly gentle and caring, especially with her children. But he also had episodes of intense rage that seemed to come from nowhere. During these episodes, he would become a completely different person, violent and unpredictable. The relationship lasted about 8 months before Tommy vanished again. This time, he took Jessica's car and several $1,000s she had saved. She filed charges, but by the time police began looking for him, Tommy was long gone. Between 1991 and 1992, Tommy traveled extensively throughout the southwestern United States. He worked at carnivals, on farms, and as a handyman. During this period, he began experiencing what he later described as blackouts, periods of time he couldn't remember. He claimed these episodes would last anywhere from a few hours to several days. Throughout 1993 and 1994, Tommy's mental state continued to deteriorate. His drug use increased, particularly his consumption of methamphetamine. He developed severe paranoia, often believing he was being followed or that people were plotting against him. He frequently changed locations, sometimes staying in homeless shelters or sleeping in abandoned buildings. During this period, he began having what he called visions, vivid hallucinations that he claimed were messages from demons. He later told investigators that these demons would command him to do things, though he was initially vague about what these commands entailed. In early 1995, Tommy showed up at his mother's house in Missouri. Nina was shocked by his appearance. He was gaunt, disheveled, and seemed mentally unstable. She tried to convince him to seek help, but he stayed only 2 days before leaving again. Later that year, he met Karen, a waitress at a diner in Texas. She was 32 and had 3 children from previous relationships. Despite his increasingly unstable behavior, they began dating. Karen later described Tommy as charming and attentive at first, but said he would sometimes become distant and strange, as if he were somewhere else entirely. Their relationship was marked by Tommy's frequent disappearances. He would vanish for days or weeks at a time, then return as if nothing had happened. Karen noticed that these absences often coincided with news reports of crimes in nearby areas, but she didn't make the connection at the time. By mid-1996, Tommy's relationship with Karen had become increasingly volatile. His paranoid delusions intensified, and he began accusing her of conspiring against him with various people: neighbors, co-workers, even strangers. He became convinced that her children were spying on him for some unnamed government agency. One night in August, after a particularly severe episode of paranoia, Tommy attacked Karen, choking her until she lost consciousness. When she came to, he was gone, along with her car and most of her savings. She filed a police report, but, as with his previous victims, Tommy had vanished without a trace. This marked the beginning of Tommy's most violent period. Over the next 18 months, he would commit a series of increasingly brutal crimes across multiple states. However, because he used different aliases and moved constantly, law enforcement didn't initially connect these incidents to a single perpetrator. During this time, Tommy later claimed his demon visions became more frequent and commanding. He described being driven by voices that ordered him to commit acts of violence. While experts would later debate whether these hallucinations were genuine or fabricated to support an insanity defense, there was no doubt that Tommy's behavior became more erratic and dangerous during this period. In December 1996, he broke into a home in Oklahoma, seriously injuring the elderly homeowner who confronted him. 2 weeks later, he robbed a convenience store in Arkansas, shooting the clerk, who survived, before fleeing with the cash register. The early months of 1997 saw Tommy's violence escalate further. In January, he brutally attacked a motel clerk in New Mexico, leaving the man in a coma. In March, he carjacked a woman in Arizona, forcing her to drive him across the state before releasing her unharmed. The woman's detailed description of her captor would later prove crucial in identifying Tommy. By this time, law enforcement agencies in several states were searching for him, though they hadn't yet connected all the crimes. Tommy managed to stay ahead of police by constantly moving and using various stolen identities. He supported himself through a combination of robbery, burglary, and occasional short-term jobs. In June 1997, Tommy committed his first confirmed murder. At a truck stop in Nevada, he killed a truck driver during an attempted robbery. The crime was particularly brutal, with the victim being stabbed multiple times. Tommy later claimed he had no memory of the incident, saying he woke up covered in blood, with no idea what had happened. 2 weeks after the truck driver's murder, Tommy killed again. This time, the victim was a convenience store clerk in California. Security camera footage showed Tommy calmly walking into the store, shooting the clerk without warning, and taking money from the register. This footage would later be crucial evidence in his trial. Throughout the summer of 1997, Tommy continued his crime spree, moving between California, Nevada, and Arizona. He committed numerous robberies and assaults, and authorities suspected him in at least 3 more murders, though these were never proven. By fall of 1997, law enforcement had finally begun to connect the dots. Analysis of crime scene evidence, witness descriptions, and security camera footage revealed that the same person was responsible for numerous violent crimes across multiple states. The FBI became involved, and Tommy was placed on their most wanted list. What made tracking Tommy particularly difficult was his ability to blend in and appear normal for short periods. He would often find temporary work at auto repair shops or construction sites, where his co-workers later described him as quiet but competent. He could be charming when necessary, and his frequent moves didn't seem unusual in industries where transient workers were common. In October 1997, Tommy committed what would be his final murders. At a small roadside motel in Arizona, he killed both the night clerk and a guest who happened to be in the lobby. The murders were captured on the motel's security cameras, providing law enforcement with their clearest images yet of the suspect. The footage was broadcast nationally, and tips began pouring in. Several of Tommy's former employers and acquaintances recognized him and contacted authorities. His mother, Nina, also saw the footage and made the difficult decision to contact the FBI, providing them with detailed information about her son's history and possible whereabouts. Armed with this new information, law enforcement narrowed their search to southern Arizona, where Tommy had been spotted several times in the previous weeks. A massive manhunt was launched, involving federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. The manhunt for Tommy lasted 3 weeks. During this time, he managed to evade capture despite numerous close calls. He later told investigators he survived by breaking into vacant vacation homes and hunting cabins, staying only briefly in each location before moving on. The end came on November 12, 1997. A patrol officer in a small Arizona town noticed a man matching Tommy's description outside a gas station. When the officer approached, Tommy attempted to flee in a stolen car, but crashed after a brief chase. He then tried to escape on foot, but was finally apprehended after a short pursuit. At the time of his arrest, Tommy was carrying 3 different sets of identification, several stolen credit cards, and a handgun linked to multiple crimes. He appeared to be under the influence of drugs and was initially combative with officers. However, once in custody, he became eerily calm and cooperative. During his initial interrogation, Tommy was largely unresponsive, staring blankly at the wall and occasionally mumbling about demons. However, over the following days, he began to talk. His statements to investigators were often contradictory and confused, mixing actual events with apparent delusions. Tommy was eventually charged with 6 murders, though investigators suspected him in several other unsolved cases. He was also charged with multiple counts of assault, robbery, and other crimes across several states. The total number of charges against him exceeded 50 counts. The legal proceedings against Tommy were complex and lengthy. Questions about his mental competency led to multiple evaluations and delays. Several psychiatrists examined him, reaching different conclusions about his mental state. Some believed he suffered from severe schizophrenia, while others thought he was malingering, exaggerating or faking symptoms for legal advantage. During this period, Tommy's behavior was erratic. Sometimes he appeared lucid and cooperative, discussing his crimes in detail. Other times, he became completely unresponsive or claimed to have no memory of his actions. He continued to talk about demon visions, though the consistency of his descriptions varied significantly. His mother, Nina, testified at his competency hearing, describing his troubled childhood and the gradual deterioration of his mental health. She spoke about his early signs of mental illness, his drug use, and her failed attempts to get him help. Her testimony provided crucial context about Tommy's history of mental instability. In March 1999, after numerous evaluations and hearings, Tommy was finally declared competent to stand trial. The prosecution sought the death penalty, citing the brutality of his crimes and the calculated nature of his actions while evading capture. The defense planned to pursue an insanity defense. The trial began in June 1999 and lasted nearly 4 months. The prosecution presented overwhelming physical evidence, including DNA, fingerprints, and security camera footage. They also called numerous witnesses, including survivors of Tommy's attacks and family members of his victims. The defense focused primarily on Tommy's mental state, bringing in experts who testified about his history of mental illness and substance abuse. They argued that his crimes were the result of severe psychosis, not rational decision-making. However, the prosecution effectively countered this argument by demonstrating Tommy's ability to plan his crimes and evade capture. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when Karen, his former girlfriend, testified. She described how Tommy's behavior had deteriorated over time, but also detailed how he maintained enough control to manipulate situations to his advantage. Her testimony severely undermined the defense's claim that Tommy was completely out of touch with reality. In October 1999, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Tommy guilty on all counts. They rejected the insanity defense, concluding that despite any mental health issues, he understood the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. In the penalty phase of the trial, the jury recommended the death penalty. On November 15, 1999, the judge formally sentenced Tommy to death. He also received multiple life sentences for his non-fatal attacks and other crimes. Tommy showed no visible reaction when the sentence was announced, staring straight ahead, just as he had throughout most of the trial. After his sentencing, Tommy was transferred to death row at the Arizona State Prison Complex. His attorneys immediately began the appeals process, challenging various aspects of the trial and his sentence. The years following Tommy's conviction brought significant developments in his case. His legal team pursued multiple appeals, focusing primarily on questions about his mental competency and the adequacy of his defense during the original trial. They argued that his mental illness had not been properly considered during the proceedings. During his time on death row, Tommy's behavior continued to be unpredictable. Prison records showed periods of relative stability interrupted by severe psychological episodes. He was frequently medicated, though his compliance with treatment was inconsistent. He maintained minimal contact with his family, occasionally exchanging letters with his mother. In 2005, Tommy's attorneys secured a significant victory when a federal appeals court ordered a new hearing to evaluate his mental competency. This decision was based on new evidence about his psychiatric history and questions about the thoroughness of the original competency evaluation. The new hearing, held in 2006, included testimony from additional mental health experts and a more detailed examination of Tommy's psychiatric records from both before and after his crimes. His prison medical records showed a consistent pattern of severe mental illness, lending credibility to claims about his compromised mental state. In a surprising development, the court ruled that Tommy's mental condition had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer be considered competent for execution. His death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. Following the commutation of his death sentence, Tommy was transferred to a specialized unit within the prison system that provided enhanced mental health services. His new environment offered more structured psychiatric care and monitoring, though his response to treatment remained variable. Through the years, several true crime authors and journalists attempted to interview Tommy, seeking to understand his motives and document his story. Most requests were denied by either Tommy himself or his attorneys. The few interviews he did grant were often incoherent, with Tommy alternating between moments of clarity and periods of obvious delusion. His mother, Nina, continued to advocate for better mental health care in the prison system, using her son's case as an example of how the system fails those with severe mental illness. She became involved with several advocacy groups and occasionally spoke at conferences about mental health reform in the criminal justice system. By 2015, Tommy had spent more than 15 years in prison. His case had become a significant reference point in ongoing debates about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the death penalty. Legal scholars and mental health professionals frequently cited his case in discussions about reform of the criminal justice system. Today, Tommy remains incarcerated in the Arizona State Prison Complex. His case continues to raise important questions about the intersection of mental illness and criminal justice, and about society's ability to balance public safety with appropriate treatment of mentally ill offenders. The legacy of Tommy's case extends beyond his personal story. It has influenced legal precedents regarding mental illness in criminal cases and contributed to ongoing discussions about reform in both the mental health and criminal justice systems. Several changes in Arizona state law regarding mental health evaluations in criminal cases can be traced back to issues raised during Tommy's trial and appeals. The case highlighted the need for more comprehensive mental health screening in the criminal justice system and better coordination between mental health and law enforcement agencies. The families of Tommy's victims have dealt with the aftermath in different ways. Some have become advocates for victims' rights or mental health reform, while others have chosen to maintain their privacy. Several have expressed mixed feelings about the commutation of his death sentence, though most acknowledged the role his mental illness played in the crimes. Karen, his former girlfriend, eventually wrote a memoir about her experiences. The book provided valuable insights into the progression of Tommy's mental illness and raised awareness about the challenges faced by families dealing with severe mental health issues. Her account has been used in training programs for mental health professionals and law enforcement. Nina continues her mental health advocacy work, though she has largely stepped back from public speaking in recent years. She maintains limited contact with Tommy through occasional supervised visits and correspondence.